You'd think losing your memory means forgetting facts. For a small number of people, it means forgetting that you exist at all, waking up in a different city, under a different name, with no idea any of it happened. It's called dissociative fugue, and it might be the strangest thing the human mind is capable of doing to itself. Not memory loss in the way you're picturing it, not forgetting where you put your keys, or blanking on someone's name at a party. This is memory loss that takes your entire identity with it, and sometimes replaces it with a completely different person, one who has no idea they used to be someone else. It's rare enough that most doctors will never see a single case in their entire careers, and well documented enough that we know, with unsettling certainty, that it's real. Here's one of the earliest and most famous documented cases. In January 1887, a preacher named Ansel Bourne stood up in his church in Rhode Island, left in the middle of the day, and disappeared. His family searched for him. Nobody could find any trace of where he'd gone. 2 months later, a man calling himself A.J. Brown was running a small stationery and confectionery shop in Norristown, Pennsylvania, roughly 200 miles away. He had rented the space, stocked it with goods, and was doing business as any ordinary shopkeeper would, apparently unremarkable to his customers and neighbors in every way. Then, one morning, he woke up confused, disoriented, and asked the people around him where he was. He had no memory of renting a shop, no memory of the past 2 months. As far as he knew, he was still Ansel Bourne, and it was still the day he'd walked out of his church. When his family found him, Bourne had no explanation for any of it. He hadn't been hiding. He hadn't been running from anything anyone could identify. For 2 months, he had simply been someone else, functioning normally, completing tasks, running a business, and speaking to customers, with zero conscious awareness that a previous version of himself had ever existed. Whatever internal experience A.J. Brown had of his own life during those 2 months, memories forming, decisions being made, a personality functioning day to day, it belonged entirely to a version of a man who, by his own understanding, didn't exist yet. The psychologist William James, one of the founders of modern psychology, became fascinated by Bourne's case and eventually put him under hypnosis to try to understand what had happened. Under hypnosis, something remarkable occurred. The A.J. Brown personality resurfaced, and this version of Bourne could describe the 2 missing months in detail: the shop, the daily routines, the customers he'd come to know. But when he wasn't hypnotized, that entire period remained completely inaccessible to him. 2 separate identities, occupying the same mind, each one blind to the other's existence unless a specific door was opened. This is what makes dissociative fugue so unlike ordinary amnesia. Ordinary amnesia usually involves losing access to memories while your sense of self stays intact. You still know you're you, even if certain memories are missing. Fugue does something stranger. It doesn't just delete memories. It can suppress the entire identity attached to them, and in some cases, allow a new one to form in its place, complete with new habits, new preferences, sometimes even a different name the person chooses without knowing why it feels right. The new identity isn't a performance or a cover story. As far as researchers can tell, the person genuinely believes it, completely, with no sense that anything is missing. Modern cases follow a similar pattern, and they're not just historical curiosities. In 2006, a woman known publicly only as Jane Doe was found wandering in Chicago, disoriented, unable to say who she was or how she'd gotten there. She had no identification, no memory of her name, her family, or her past. For months, despite national media coverage and a public appeal for anyone who recognized her, nobody came forward to claim her, and she remained functionally a stranger to her own life, living under a placeholder identity, while doctors and investigators searched for any trace of who she used to be. Eventually, her identity was recovered, revealing a documented history and family who had been searching for her. But for those months, she existed in the same suspended state Bourne had, present, coherent, functional, and utterly disconnected from her own past. So what actually causes this? Researchers who study dissociative fugue generally point to one common thread: overwhelming psychological stress or trauma, often severe enough that the mind essentially exits the situation entirely, not through denial or distraction, but through a complete, if temporary, deletion of the self that was suffering. It's frequently described as an extreme form of psychological escape, one so complete that the person doesn't just leave the situation behind. They leave the version of themselves that was in it behind too. In many documented cases, once researchers pieced together the timeline afterward, the fugue began within days of a major personal loss, financial collapse, or unbearable conflict, something the original identity had no visible way of surviving intact. This is where the condition starts to feel less like a medical curiosity and more like a genuinely unsettling question about what identity actually is. Because if a mind under enough pressure can simply set down an entire identity and construct a new one, functional, coherent, capable of holding a job and speaking to strangers, then whatever you is might be a lot less fixed than it feels from the inside. Identity, in cases like this, starts to look less like a solid, permanent structure and more like something the brain actively maintains and renews moment to moment, something that can, under extreme enough conditions, simply be dropped and quietly rebuilt from whatever material is closest at hand. Fugue states are also notoriously difficult to study because they're rare, they're unpredictable, and by definition, the person experiencing one usually has no idea anything unusual is happening to them at the time. There's no warning sign visible from the inside. No moment where the old identity announces it's about to disappear. Most documented cases, like Bourne's and Jane Doe's, are only pieced together after the fact, once the fugue ends and the original identity resurfaces. Often with the same disorientation and missing time that the new identity would have felt if it had ever become aware of the old one. That resurfacing itself raises another uncomfortable question. When Ansel Bourne woke up as himself again, what happened to A.J. Brown? By every functional measure, A.J. Brown had been a real person for 2 months. He'd made decisions, held conversations, run a business, built small daily routines that felt, to him, like an entire ordinary life. And then, without warning or transition, he was simply gone, replaced by a version of Bourne who had no memory of being him, and in some sense, no way of ever proving he hadn't just been born all along, quietly running a shop with a very convenient 2-month gap in his memory. Some researchers who study identity and consciousness have used cases like this to argue that our sense of a single, continuous self is more of a story the brain tells than a literal, unbroken fact. Under normal conditions, that story holds together seamlessly enough that we never question it, the same way you don't notice the individual frames of a film while you're watching it. But dissociative fugue shows what happens when the story breaks, cleanly, completely, and without the person even noticing the seam. Most people who experience a fugue state never experience a second one, and treatment, when it's needed at all, generally focuses on addressing the underlying trauma or stressor rather than the fugue itself, since the fugue is understood as a symptom rather than the core problem. Memory for the fugue period sometimes returns gradually, sometimes all at once, and sometimes, as in a small number of documented cases, it never returns at all, leaving a permanent gap where an entire chapter of a person's life used to be, a period they lived through in full, as someone else, that simply isn't accessible to the person who's asking about it now. There's something quietly vertigo-inducing about sitting with that fact for too long. Most of us move through our lives assuming the person reading these words right now is the same continuous you who woke up this morning, the same one who existed a year ago, a decade ago. Dissociative fugue suggests that continuity isn't guaranteed by anything except the brain's willingness to keep telling itself the same story, day after day, without interruption. For most people, it always will. But for a very small number, the story stops mid-sentence, and somewhere, without any warning at all, a new one quietly begins, with its own name, its own habits, and absolutely no memory of ever being anyone else. The next time you take for granted that you'll wake up tomorrow as the same person who went to sleep tonight, It might be worth remembering that for a handful of people in recorded history, that wasn't true, and they didn't find out until someone else told them.